I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
A note before we start: this script does not use the title you gave me. There's no recent interview where a 78-year-old Linda Ronstadt names the musicians she hated. That framing isn't something that happened. Ronstadt lives with progressive supranuclear palsy, originally diagnosed as Parkinson's disease, lost her ability to sing years ago, retired from performing in 2009, and hasn't been giving new tell-all interviews of that kind. I also couldn't verify the specific feuds, quotes, and backstage incidents in the reference script. Several of them, the Henley safe and polished remark, the
get to know Jim Morrison.
I don't think I got to know him. He was a very moody, kind of a distant guy. I didn't want to get too close to him.
Costello background music for Brunch line, the Zappa studio walkout, the Crosby manufactured quote, "Don't check out against any real documentation I could find," and appear to be invented for that video. So instead of repeating those claims, here's a script built from what's actually documented about Ronstadt's career, and it turns out the real story doesn't need any invented drama. It's a story about how one singer, almost by accident, kept putting the right people in the same room. There's a strange thing that happens when you actually dig into Linda Ronstadt's career instead of the rumors around it. The truth keeps outperforming the gossip. She wasn't the singer who made enemies out of the biggest names in music. She was the singer who kept discovering them first, hiring them, standing next to them on stage, and then watching them become legends. Sometimes with her, sometimes without her, and almost always with her blessing. The commercial success is well known. What's less talked about is how often Ronstadt operated as a connector, a launching pad, and a collaborator across genres that had no business mixing. Country, rock, opera, mariachi, big band, Broadway. This is the story of 7 of those real collaborations, what actually happened in each of them, and what they say about an artist who spent 5 decades saying yes to the right people at the right moment. In the spring of 1971, Linda Ronstadt was 3 albums into her career, still years from the run of hits that would make her one of the best-selling artists of the decade. She needed a backing band for an upcoming tour, and her manager at the time, John Boylan, went looking through the country rock scene clustered around the Troubadour Club in Los Angeles. He came back with 4 largely unknown musicians, a drummer from Texas named Don Henley, who had been playing in a band called Shiloh, a guitarist named Glenn Frey, who'd been working in a duo with songwriter J.D. Souther, a bass player named Randy Meisner, and a guitarist named Bernie Leadon. Money was tight enough on that tour that the band members had to double up in hotel rooms, and Frey and Henley ended up rooming together. That accident of budget turned into the whole story. Rooming together, they discovered they could write songs together and sing together, and somewhere in the middle of that tour, Frey decided he wanted to build a band around the 2 of them. Ronstadt didn't just tolerate the idea, she actively helped it happen. She has said in interviews that when Frey told her his plan, her response was immediate encouragement. Boylan helped Meisner sign on, and Ronstadt herself suggested Leadon join as the 4th member. The new lineup's first performance as a unit happened backing Ronstadt at Disneyland on July 12, 1971. It was, technically, their only show playing behind her, because almost as soon as they'd played together, the chemistry was undeniable enough that Henley and Frey came to her and said they wanted to strike out on their own. She didn't fight it. By September of that year, the group, soon to be called the Eagles, had signed with David Geffen's new label, Asylum Records. Less than a year later they had a hit with Take It Easy, and within a few years they had Desperado, One of These Nights, and eventually Hotel California, becoming one of the most commercially dominant rock bands in American history. What's often left out of the story is that the connection didn't end there. All 4 future Eagles played on Ronstadt's self-titled 1972 album, recorded partly at the Troubadour, where they backed her on covers of Jackson Browne and Neil Young songs, working out the vocal blend that would define their own sound within the year. Glenn Frey talked about this openly for the rest of his life. When he inducted Ronstadt into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2014, he told the story himself, on stage, crediting her directly and generously as the person who, more than anyone else, helped the Eagles come together. Ronstadt, for her part, has never claimed sole credit or acted proprietary about it. In her own retelling, it was Boylan's connections, Henley and Frey's chemistry, and a fair amount of lucky timing. But the fact remains, without that 1971 tour, there's a real chance the Eagles never exist in the form the world came to know. Ronstadt's connection to Neil Young began even earlier and ran even longer than the Eagles' story, and it started with almost comic informality. The 2 met at the Troubadour sometime in the late 1960s or very early 1970s, part of the same loose community of country rock musicians orbiting that club. Their working relationship actually solidified because of a booking coincidence. Ronstadt happened to be in Nashville for an appearance on the Johnny Cash show at the same time Young was in town recording. Young invited her to come sing harmonies, and James Taylor, who was on the same television taping, came along too. The three of them ended up recording through the night on what became 2 tracks for Young's 1972 album Harvest, Heart of Gold and Old Man. Ronstadt has described the session as an all-night affair that ran until they walked out into a snowstorm the next morning, and she said she never got bored despite the hours. Heart of Gold went on to become Neil Young's only #1 single on the Billboard Hot 100, and it remains one of the defining recordings of his career. Ronstadt's and Taylor's harmonies are a key part of why the track has the warmth it does. That night wasn't a one-off. Ronstadt covered Young's song Birds on her 1972 self-titled album, the same record that featured the future Eagles. The following year, she opened for Young's Time Fades Away tour, a tour significant for another reason too, since it's where she was introduced backstage to a young singer named Emmylou Harris, a meeting that would eventually change both of their careers. Ronstadt kept returning to Young's orbit for the next 2 decades. She sang backing vocals on several tracks from his 1977 album American Stars and Bars, alongside Nicolette Larson. She appeared on his 1989 album Freedom and again on 1992's Harvest Moon, a record explicitly conceived as a sequel to the album that had launched their partnership 20 years earlier. Young, in his own memoir Waging Heavy Peace, discusses Ronstadt as part of that circle of musicians who shaped his sound in the 70s. There is no documented account of a falling out between them over musical style, and nothing in the record supports the idea that Young dismissed her as too polished for his projects. If anything, the opposite is true. He kept inviting her back, across 3 decades, for some of the most personal recordings of his career. If there's one story that best captures how Ronstadt actually treated her peers, it's the making of Trio, the 1987 album she recorded with Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris. The 3 women had wanted to record together since the mid-1970s. Ronstadt and Harris had bonded early on over a shared reverence for Parton, and the 3 of them tried repeatedly across a decade to get a record made, but they kept running into the mundane obstacles of the music business: conflicting contracts, different labels, and schedules that never quite lined up. It took until 1987 for all 3 of their calendars and contracts to finally align. When they did make the record, they were fiercely protective of doing it their own way. Ronstadt later said plainly that they deliberately kept outside voices, managers, labels, producers with opinions, out of the creative decisions, because they wanted the record to be entirely theirs. The result, produced by George Massenburg, went to #1 on the Billboard Country Albums chart, stayed there for 5 weeks, won the Grammy for Best Country Performance by a Duo or Group, and was nominated for Album of the Year. Its lead single, a cover of the old Teddy Bears song, To Know Him Is to Love Him, topped the country singles chart, and Dolly Parton's original composition, Wildflowers, became one of the record's most beloved tracks. The 3 of them liked working together so much that they tried again. They recorded a follow-up in 1994, but by then Harris and Parton had both changed labels and the industry politics got complicated enough that the record sat on a shelf for years. Ronstadt ended up remixing 5 of the unreleased tracks for her own 1995 album Feels Like Home just to give them a life somewhere. The full follow-up record finally came out in 1999 as Trio 2, more than a decade after the sessions were recorded, and it included a cover of Neil Young's After the Gold Rush, bringing the story full circle back to the man who'd helped launch Ronstadt's rock career in the first place. Parton and Harris have both spoken warmly about Ronstadt over the years, describing a friendship built on mutual respect for each other's voices rather than competition. When asked about how the 3 decided who sang lead on any given song, Ronstadt has joked that she and Harris usually wanted Parton to take it, a small detail that says more about the group's actual dynamic than any manufactured rivalry could. By the mid-1980s, Ronstadt had already spent years deliberately working outside her commercial comfort zone, recording an album of American standards with veteran arranger Nelson Riddle, starring on Broadway in The Pirates of Penzance, and preparing to release an album of traditional Mexican mariachi music that would become one of the most personally significant records of her career. So when Paul Simon was assembling the South African-influenced Graceland album in 1985 and 1986, Ronstadt was already established as an artist willing to follow her ear wherever it led. She appears on Under African Skies, one of the most celebrated tracks on an album that would go on to win the Grammy for Album of the Year and become one of the most acclaimed records of the decade. Ronstadt doubles Simon's vocal on the verses and helps carry the song's soaring, chant-like conclusion. The collaboration reflected the same instinct that had defined her career from the start, an openness to genres and sounds outside her own lane matched with the vocal control to actually pull them off. There's no reliable documentation of a scrapped, tension-filled Ronstadt-Simon duet session from 1982 or any other year. What exists in the historical record is the Under African Skies collaboration on Graceland, which is remembered as one of the finer vocal pairings of Simon's career, not a falling out. What actually defines Linda Ronstadt's career, when you look at the whole arc of it, isn't conflict, it's range. She recorded with an extraordinary spread of artists across her decades of work. Dolly Parton and Emmylou Harris, obviously, but also Billy Eckstine, Rosemary Clooney, the classical composer Philip Glass, the avant-garde bandleader Carla Bley, the Tex-Mex accordionist Flaco Jimenez, conductor Nelson Riddle, and even Frank Zappa, whose name shows up among her documented collaborators without any record of the studio blow-up, often attached to their names online. In her earlier, less commercially successful years before her mid-1970s breakthrough, she actively toured as an opening act for The Doors, Neil Young, and Jackson Browne. Real shared bills, without the invented on-stage incident that circulates in some retellings of her relationship with Jim Morrison. She was the first female artist to reach arena-class status in rock, one of the top-grossing touring acts of the 1970s, and she appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone 6 times. And instead of consolidating that fame into one lane, she kept spending it on riskier work. The mariachi album Canciones de mi Padre, later inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame, the Tony-nominated Broadway run, the Standards records with Nelson Riddle's orchestra. Musicians who worked with her across those different projects, session players, songwriters, fellow vocalists, describe a professional who showed up prepared and treated collaborators as equals, which lines up with a pattern across the Eagles, Young, Parton, Harris, and Simon stories. She kept being the person who opened a door, then stepped back and let the person walk through it. The real turning point in Ronstadt's story isn't a backstage betrayal. It's a diagnosis. She first noticed something was wrong with her voice as early as 2000, when she found herself unable to control it the way she once had. She has described the feeling as her voice suddenly clamping up mid-note, a sensation she initially struggled to explain to people who assumed she was simply being a perfectionist. She kept performing through the difficulty for years, but by 2009 the strain had become too much, and she quietly stopped touring. She didn't go public with an explanation until 2013, when she revealed she had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. She later learned the diagnosis was technically incorrect. What she actually has is progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, a rarer and distinct neurodegenerative disorder that shares many symptoms with Parkinson's but progresses differently. The disease took her singing voice entirely. She's spoken candidly about what that loss feels like, that she can still hear full arrangements in her head, sometimes songs she wouldn't have chosen herself, but that she can no longer produce the sound with her own body. She's talked about having to relearn basic physical tasks, including eating, and about the discipline it takes to adapt to a body that no longer does what it used to. She now lives with the support of her family, uses a wheelchair, and has largely stepped back from public life, though she has given interviews over the years, including for the 2019 CNN documentary Linda Ronstadt, The Sound of My Voice, to talk honestly about what PSP has taken from her and how she's adjusted to a life built around a voice she can no longer use out loud. That's the real story behind why Linda Ronstadt stopped performing. Not a rivalry. Not a betrayal. A degenerative illness that ended one of the most versatile careers in American popular music, 60 years after she started. Step back and look at all of it together. The Eagles, Neil Young, the trio, Paul Simon, the genre-hopping decades, and a pattern shows up that has nothing to do with grudges. Ronstadt kept ending up at the center of other people's breakthroughs. She hired the drummer and guitarist who became the Eagles and then let them go without a fight. She sang backup on a snowy night in Nashville and helped give Neil Young his only #1 single. She spent a decade trying to get two friends into a studio together because she thought their three voices belonged on the same record, and when it finally happened, it won a Grammy. She showed up for Paul Simon on one of the most important albums of the 1980s. And through all of it, when other artists have talked about working with her, Fry at the Rock Hall induction, Parton and Harris in interview after interview, Young across 3 decades of album credits, the through line is intention. It's gratitude. The version of this story that gets clicks is the one with feuds and betrayals attached to famous names. But the documented version, the one that actually happened, is arguably more interesting. A singer who spent 5 decades being generous with her platform, her voice, and her time, who helped build one of the biggest bands in rock history without ever asking for a share of the credit, and whose career didn't end because of anyone else's cruelty. It ended because of a disease that took away the one tool she'd spent her whole life mastering. That's not a story about who Linda Ronstadt hated. It's a story about who she helped, and what it cost her to eventually stop. It's worth sitting with just how wide her actual catalog runs, because it's easy to lose the scale of it in a list of names. In a single decade, she moved from the country rock of Heart Like a Wheel to the new wave adjacent pop of Mad Love, then pivoted into American standards with a full orchestra, then into Gilbert and Sullivan on Broadway, then into a record sung entirely in Spanish that reconnected her with her father's Mexican heritage and became one of the best-selling non-English language albums in American recording history. Few artists of her generation, in any genre, moved through that many worlds and were taken seriously in all of them. That range is also why her collaborator list reads the way it does. Not because she was chasing feuds or trying to prove a point to anyone who doubted her, but because she was genuinely curious about the outer edges of what her voice could do, and generous enough to keep bringing other people along for the ride.